Good morning, everyone in U.S. history, too. I wanted to tackle, or at least discuss in brief detail, some of the things I think are important from Chapter 20 dealing with the Progressive Era, that period at the end of the 19th century into maybe the first 2 decades of the 20th century. There's no fine line that has a specific date. This is the start of the progressive era and this is the end, but they make up, sort of part of the scale of time that we think of as the end of the late 1800s and going into the 1920s. And the progressive era never really stops entirely. There's still arguments of progressive movements going on to this day, and the ripple effect from the height of the progressive era still permeates our history and our identity to this day. It's one of my favorite areas of U.S. history. I did put up 2 other videos that were produced, one by the Khan Academy, which always does a fantastic job on its educational videos. Maybe not the most always compelling in terms of entertainment value. I think that's 7 or 8 minutes, but there's one much longer, it's 30 minutes. I don't know if it's been produced by CBS or PBS. I believe I may have watched it there. It's just an excellent and very entertaining discussion of all the permeations of this era of time in American history. I know I've watched it in the past. I thought it was great. And I'm like, well, geez, maybe the students want to watch it. And I know some of you are sitting there saying, what is this guy killing me? I'm reading this very wordy, lengthy text. I don't even like history. I'm taking this class because I have to. And now he's posting a video that I should watch based upon his summary, but then also the Khan Academy video as well as this PBS video. I'm just trying to bring as many resources to the fore, if you will, to help you understand these concepts. It's totally optional how much you put into it, but I like to think of education sometimes as a buffet. You take as much as you want or as little as you want, but it's really up to you. You're paying for it. But I think if I can find good resources for you, it doesn't hurt for me to put them up there. So that's why they're there. If you're saying, hey, there's other videos besides Corman's summary up here, just thought they were fantastic. So the progressive era, we know there's this huge industrial revolution in the United States of America. It changes society. We become much more urbanized. So there's industrialization, there's urbanization, there's great wealth accumulating in very small numbers of what I think of as almost oligarchs because they have a lot of control in government as well. And there's a growing population of very poor and significantly populated by recent immigrants to this country. There's also a growing middle class. It's not like all good, like very, very good and very, very bad. There's a middling group growing as well in the middle class. But along with it comes a lot of strife. There's urban decay, there's ghettos, there's very, very wretched living conditions for many of the poor immigrant laboring groups. There's poor sanitation, there's strife, there's societal strife, and especially with the growing middle class, there's a movement now among even some of the great riches, or, the robber barons, if you will, although they did many cruel and perhaps unfair practices to make their great wealth. They even recognize there needs to be changes in society. And there's a growing perspective that it shouldn't be done just by, private organizations like churches and civic groups. It should also be that government plays a role in uplifting society. And religious groups not only no longer just want to look to save the soul, they look to save society. It's called the social gospel that grows up during this period. And this is when many religious groups really got into social activism and trying to create educational environments, living environments, food availability for the poor, and all these things really grew exponentially during this era of what I think of the first couple of decades in the 20th century. So I like this one thing that kind of summarizes to me. Reformers sought to clean up politics. There's a lot of machine politics. And when I think of machine politics, I'm talking about corrupt politicians that controlled a lot of the revenue and or projects that came out of any of the large communities. And in order to participate in it, you had to be part of these machines. And it was considered political, really political corruption. Although, like anything else, these politically corrupt groups often actually had a reciprocal event of actually benefiting some of the communities that they fought for, but they obviously lined their own pockets as well. But the reform movement was part to remedy this political corruption that was clearly existing in all the large cities. They also, Black Americans, and they were not the only group identified with trying to lift up the impoverished and chronically discriminated against Black Americans. There were also obviously allegiances with white progressives as well. But this is an interesting thing. Many of the progressives in that era actually believed that segregation was appropriate, and that the uplifting or the changes and benefits that they wanted to bring to communities weren't necessarily to all in the community. It was often just towards those that they identified as akin to themselves, the whites. So there's a racial component that surprises a lot of people in the progressive movement. But Black Americans continued their long struggle for civil rights. Women demanded the vote with greater intensity, and it starts off with the states a lot. This book does a decent job on it, and it does mention that I believe it's 7 or 8 Western states, when they first created their constitutions, actually gave the right to vote in state elections and local elections to women, and that obviously gave some impetus to the federal government to finally try to pass an amendment, which was the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which finally passed, giving women the right for suffrage on the national level and on the state level as well, because of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. States can't deprive people of a fundamental right, and that was the 19th Amendment, passed in 1919. I think it became effective technically in 1920. But it's amazing how many causes they fought for in terms of correcting urban strife by the social. Some of you are human service majors. I know some of you are, because you take this class because it feels a requirement. It was an amazing process of creating these sort of civic groups, and many of them were run by women, people like Jane Addams and others. Not only to get the vote, but also to create a more equitable society, a cleanlier society, and a more humanitarian society for those that were struggling under this great urbanization and industrialization that occurred at this time. Others, it says, workers demanded higher wages, safer workplaces, and the union recognition that would guaranteeing them rights. Whatever their goals, reform became the word of the age. And it was really quite a phenomenon that occurred at this time. And one of the things that triggered it were some of the great unsafe work conditions. The story of child labor. We've all seen, maybe you haven't all seen it, but I know I did when I was going through school and starting these things, where little kids would be working in these very dangerous factories, getting paid basically whatever wage that the employer could give. There was no minimum wage laws that existed at this era, but that was the push, things like that. Minimum wage, no child labor laws, or minimum child labor laws, in order to not basically create a society that we had throwaway children in. And one of the great tragedies of that era that started shedding light on it was not only that, we had journalists that started revealing, both in terms of the modern pictures that would really sell the community on the horrors of how the working conditions are for industrial workers, children, women, and others. And then some of the tragedies came out. One of the biggest ones was the Triangle Shirt Factory in Manhattan. It caught fire, and these women were hanging out the window, and they'd just be jumping to their death one after the other. And in the end, 71 workers were injured, but 146 had died either by burning to death. And people just witnessed it. There was no fire apparatus to really deal with it. And the doors were locked by the managers because they were worried that these women would take unauthorized breaks. And so they had to lock the doors, and they kept the keys. They managed to escape. The managers did. But these young ladies perished in the cruelest and most barbaric way ever. And this started some of the reform movements that we needed, these sort of what we think of today as OSHA regulations, egress and exit and fire safety and fire equipment and, safe working conditions that we take for granted today were born out of the era of the progressive era. I actually, there's a couple, I didn't want to post too many videos because it'd be saying, oh my God, this guy's working us to death even more. But there's a great documentary on PBS I watched a few years ago just on the Triangle Shirt Waste Factory and how horrific it was. Workers' death were answered with little punishment, and business owners' responsibility for dangerous conditions weren't really brought about. And we know there was a thing in journalism then called muckrakers. Muckrakers not only exposed corrupt government activities, but they exposed the cruelty of industrialization. They exposed the other half, how the other half lives, if you will. And that brought a desire of those who had money and not necessarily the wealthiest, but people who had a say in government said it's time to take a stand. We've got to make some changes in order to lift up all of society, or at least all of society that we cared about, because there was still a big distinction in race. Even in the North, there was a big belief that the things we were fighting for were different for different peoples. And there was a thing called eugenics at this period of time that really believed that there was a superior race, the Anglo-Saxon race, and all the races were inferior. in the Anglo-Saxon race should be propagated and improved, and those races that were not Anglo-Saxon should be curtailed from further advancement. And I know that sounds so inconsistent with the term progressivism, but it was definitely part of it. And we know there's some famous books that came out of there. Jacob Riis is one of the great. How the Other Half Lives is a book he wrote, and he was a journalist that took pictures of how these people lived in really wretched conditions, in unsafe buildings and crowded houses, unsanitary conditions with no schooling, and the pay being awful and often having to work, 16, 17-hour days, sometimes 7 days, well, not 7 days a week, but usually 6 days a week. And then Upton Sinclair's famous The Jungle. Many of you may have to read it in college. Initially, it was a book designed to reveal some of the labor practices and industry in the slaughterhouses in Chicago. I think it was in Chicago. Chicago and the stockyards of Chicago. It was really to display the wretchedness of the work they had to do, but instead it revealed the disgusting nature of how our meat processing occurred, and it really horrified people. And the result of that book, basically, government was motivated because it wasn't seen to be a private affair anymore. It was government needed to intervene, and that came about. The Safe Food and Drug Administration started talking about ways in which foods had to be processed, packaged, and/or delivered to the consumer in a facially safe and valid way. And then it was a very, very famous author, though it's at the very early part of the progressive era. It was Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards. It was a huge national sensation, and this was about looking for a utopia and a better society that we weren't. The industrialization put great wealth in a handful of people's pockets, and although there was a rising middle class, a lot of people discount that, and basically it made it sound like it was just a handful of very rich and everyone else was poor. There was a growing middle class as well too, but there was a huge amount, especially of recent immigrants, that were very, very poor, very impoverished, and very depraved in our society. And there was just a movement both among religious groups, women were significantly behind it, to improve the lives of inner city people and to make for safer working conditions and sanitary programs and the rest. William Jennings Bryan was a big part of this, even though we studied him in previous chapters about politics. That's the problem with history. We tend to carve out little sections and they don't see how they overlap. But William Jennings Bryan was definitely a progressive that pushed for it. And ironically, so was Teddy Roosevelt. We know Teddy Roosevelt often considered him, he coined the term muckrakers about these journalists, but many people think of him as a big trust buster. He was in there going in and breaking up all these large monopolies and things like that. That's a bit exaggerated. He was actually fairly pro-business as long as the businesses weren't abusive. And he thought some monopolies would actually be good monopolies, and it was up to his good and wise judgment to determine which ones were good and which ones weren't. And he truly believed that. It was sort of his own, understanding of the mechanisms of industry that determine which monopolies were good and which were bad. And he actually wanted to work in a sort of a joint effort with labor and industry to come about with a more humanitarian and fair way in which business would do business. But he didn't believe businesses should be shut down and all monopolies should be shut down. And he only went after a handful of them that were most likely for abuse, but which gives Roosevelt an interesting historical sort of bent is he's a Republican, and Republicans were notorious for the laissez-faire attitude that businesses know what's best for business and the government should stay the hell out. And he was often considered a traitor to his party because he was actively involved in trying to get legislation passed like the Clayton Act and the Sherman Act that limited the ability of companies to become monopolistic through trust formation and or just monopolistic in their own name. You should know the difference between a vertical monopoly and a horizontal. Horizontal, basically, you buy up all the other competitors, no other competitors. Vertical is you just own everything from the raw materials to the end product of delivery and marketing and selling of a product. So there's no basically consumer benefit, and therefore price fixing can occur. It's usually obvious with monopolies and why they're considered damning. And we still fight over those kinds of things today. And you should know about the American religion started converting to the social gospel. No longer are we just going to save souls, we're going to save communities and different groups. I went to Springfield College as an undergrad. Springfield College was a big part of this. It started in the 1800s, but they're still around today. They were a big part of the Young Men's Christians Association, which is a progressive movement in urban centers to actually improve the lives of Christians, not just in terms of their spirituality and their souls, but in terms of giving them a place to do physical exercise, to get get clean, to get healthy, and to be part of a community that was rising. So this rising tide lifts all boats was a big part of it. So the American religious movement that was going on was the social gospel, and that was huge during that era. I'm just reading some of this. The women's movement was fascinating. I think I told this class, I know I told some other class, that I went to Seneca Falls, New York, where they had the big Seneca Falls Women Convention back in 1848. Now, these groups have been fighting for women's suffrage and the right to vote and participate in society equal with men forever, and they fought for many concepts. Like they fought for they were big on the abolitionists. They were big in the temperance movement about banning alcohol because it was harmful to the human health and safety of communities. They felt they often fought for many of the social reform movements that were going on throughout society, and yet they were often put in a sort of the back room, if you will. They didn't have a seat at the table in terms of civic participation. And then it really took off in this early part of the 1900s, and we know it culminated with the right of women to get the national right to vote and basically become statewide as well because of the 14th Amendment, and that was in the 19th Amendment in 1919 into 1920. It's amazing. It's only been 101 years, 102 years. And these groups also often fought for other causes too, like they were anti-imperialist. The women's movement often was. They were also often part of the movement to ban alcohol, the temperance movement, and they were huge in that. And that was passed in 1920. I better look that up for you because I don't remember the specific date. I believe it was right around 1920. It was ratified in 1919, basically the banning of alcohol, and it didn't last very long. We know that lasted a couple decades, and it backfired, quite frankly. But they were trying to do what? They were trying to clean up cities, and they felt that alcohol was decaying the inner city life. The urbanization, along with too much alcohol, was breaking up the family. Now, Hull House, you should know that was Jane Addams. Jane Addams actually got the Nobel Peace Prize, but she was also a pacifist. She fought for causes of that nature. She was a very broad-based progressive. And she started this thing called the Hull House, which was these types of community centers that were to help children for daycare, to help parents become better parents, to help them with sanitary conditions, to help educate their children, to basically be social safety nets for a community that was underserved by its government and by its inability to earn its own income because the government didn't interfere with things like minimum wage and or work conditions. And of course, the union movement's big then. Yeah, she got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991. She was a big opposer of World War I as well. In hindsight, that might look like a mistake, but in the era, she was definitely a person that was very progressive. And we know in 1911, 6 Western states already passed suffrage amendments to their own constitutions. So the progress is rolling on. They were picketing the White House every single day. And eventually Woodrow Wilson said, enough's enough, women should have the right to vote. And then we finally got 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of the states to vote for it. That's how hard it is to get a constitutional amendment done. But here's what's really an inconsistency in the movement. It sounds like a beautiful movement, right? We're gonna make society better. We're gonna make people have basic humanitarian sort of basics in order to be a part of the American world. But it often was, the populist movement was often anti-immigrant, and it was often anti-African American. People are really surprised by that. You'd think it would be consistent with trying to give, voters' rights and protections from lynchings and equal protection of the law. It wasn't the case. It was often very much inclined for white Protestant immigrants as opposed to the Southern European immigrants and African Americans. And just looking at it right here, I'm just going to read this to you. Many suffragettes, women seeking the right to vote for women, adopted a much crueler message. Some, even outside the South, argued what white women's votes were necessary in order to maintain white supremacy. Many white American women argued that enfranchisement of white upper and middle class women would counteract black voters. These arguments even stretched into international politics. But whether the message advocated gender equality, class politics, or white supremacy, the suffragette campaign was winning. Yeah, it was winning them to get the right to vote, but there was an underlying bigotry, not with all suffragettes, but with many of them. And really quite surprising. then targeting the trust. We know the promise of the American life. Different authors and different, basically, participants in society that had the ear of the population was hearing about these unbelievable trusts in oil, steel, rails, finances. All of these, major robber barons were basically making a ton of money, and it was hurting industry, it was hurting the consumer, and all the wealth that was becoming expansively gained was only going into a handful of pockets. And so there was a new movement by society to curtail the abuses of industrial growth in the wealth of only a few. And we know who gets a lot of credit for that is Teddy Roosevelt, but it's obviously the legislature and society as a whole by adopting things like the Sherman Act, which was circumvented by the Supreme Court for a while. Actually, the Sherman Act was used against unions for a long time, but later the Clayton Act and the Sherman Act in combination really tried to end the abuses. Not all abuses. It had to be a design to basically curtail consumer choice and or not designed to hurt industry as a whole in terms of competition. So kind of a rule of reason thing. I'm getting off track, but I want you to know that initially these laws didn't always pay off in terms of curbing industrial and financial abuses by the very wealthy. Yeah, later, the federal government finally, after some later court rulings that rearranged their interpretation of how the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act could be interpreted, they started using it to influence interstate commerce. The Sherman Act declared that all monopolies were illegal and only those unreasonably but not all were illegal, only those that unreasonably stifled trade. So if it didn't unreasonably do it, they could continue to do so. But the Clayton Act tightened that up a bit. And we know Roosevelt was a guy that really believed in these things. Yeah, the Clayton Antitrust Act substantially enhanced the Sherman Act, specifically regulating mergers, price discrimination, protecting labor's access to collective bargaining, and related strategies of picketing, boycotting, and protesting. Because basically unions weren't recognized very much before this period of time, and they were constantly crushed by industry. And now the government basically protected the ability to organize, and that was created a more equitable society. Things like fighting for the 8-hour day, the 40-hour work week, time off from work, benefits, safety work conditions, all of them came about as a result of the union pressures that were allowed to be allayed because unions were now protected under the Clayton Act. I'm surprised in here it's progressive environmentalism because the book does a fantastic job of this. A lot of people don't get this because even the cons video, the Khan Academy, suggests that conservatism in terms of national resources and preservation are the same. They are not. These guys were actually in competition. The preservationists, guys like John Muir, wanted to preserve the redwoods as they were, not to be cut, not to be used, to preserve as sort of a permanent enshrinement to what nature can give for beautification and for people to enjoy. But there was other people in government that often get credit for being a conservation and preservation, but are not. That's a preservationist. Leave it as it is untouched. Conservationists wanted to use it in the most efficient and reasonable and appropriate fashion, including allowing businesses to entertain and use natural resources as long as it was done rationally and scientifically. And that's Gifford Pinchot. And those two guys hated each other. John Muir and Gifford Pinchot had two different philosophies. One's conservation, like, hey, we need to save water, so we should dam up this natural river that's in a valley and therefore create water resources for farmers and things in the area while still maintaining some of the natural beauties and benefits of it, where Gifford would be in complete opposition to someone like John Muir. Said, no, you got to leave it alone. Human intervention shouldn't be used except for the walking through and leave no trace. And but both of those movements were at hand during this era. Both in some ways progressed in the same direction. They weren't necessarily entirely in contradiction to one another. But one of my favorites involved in this was Teddy Roosevelt was on board. Teddy Roosevelt was good friends with both John Muir and Gifford Pinchot. Well, he worked for Gifford Pinchot worked for Teddy Roosevelt, and many of the national parks were created during this period of time. Now, Muir, on the side of preservation, is advocating set aside pristine lands and their aesthetic and spiritual value for those who could take his advice to get in touch with the nerves of Mother Earth. Pinchot, on the other hand, led the charge for conservation, a kind of environmental utilitarianism that emphasized the efficient use of available resources through planning, control, and the prevention of waste. Sometimes consistent, sometimes inconsistent. But we know when you have Theodore Roosevelt as the president on board with these thought process, because we know there was unbelievable pollution. Rivers were completely destroyed by industrial discharge during this period of time. The air was probably dirtier then than it is now in many of these industrial districts. And we recognize basically when you did clear cut forestry practices, the earth never really recovered the same way. They didn't regenerate. So we know that forestry practices started to change under Pinchot in terms of a rational forestry plan where you cut certain old growth and you let there, do replanting, all that kind of stuff. And I love that whole theory, because when I was in law school, I had to write a dissertation, and believe it or not, I did my dissertation on a very esoteric topic of economic and legal theory based upon forestry practice in the United States. I don't know what the hell I was thinking when I picked that topic, but I wrote like a 100-page paper on basically John Murr's view of forest practices, as well as Gifford Pinchot's and others, and how it evolved during this period of time, showing more scientific reasons, rationale in the way in which we harvest natural resources so we can keep them going for future generations. Boring as hell. And conservationists, yeah, things like that. Now Jim Crow, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, not that it doesn't deserve a lot of time, but it is depressing as hell. And although we didn't have this as much in the North still celebrated, but there were still a lot of people in the North that believed in something called segregation. And segregation was alive and well in this country since I was a little kid. I know I was a product of busing, for example, because we had segregated schools even here in Massachusetts. I grew up in Springfield, Mass., and the segregation orders came down in the 1970s as a result of Brown versus Board of Education came out in 54, but nothing happened after that order. Like basically, African American kids often lived in certain neighborhoods, so they went to their neighborhood schools, and white kids often lived in white neighborhoods, and they went to white schools. And they said, well, that's not enough to end segregation. We have to make sure there's desegregation in schools. And so they created a busing program in Massachusetts, maybe in other states as well. And I distinctly remember no longer being able to walk to my neighborhood school. I was bused down to a different neighborhood in order to have a more diversified ethnic and racial student body. But we know before that happened, we're talking about the turn of the century, it's the 1900s. And we know that there was unbelievable lack of fulfillment of the amendments to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment, equal protection of the law, due process of law. The 15th Amendment, you can't disenfranchise African American males from voting. All of those things were ignored in almost every southern state, and they would do it by creating these so-called Jim Crow laws. And man, it was unbelievable that this existed really to the 1950s and 60s, when what I call the second wave of the civil rights movement really had to bring attention to it, and laws had to be in place, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That John F. Kennedy gets a lot of credit for, but he was dead when it was passed. It's Lyndon Johnson that got it through. People argue that John F. Kennedy was the impetus for it, but I'm way off track of that too. So the South had become the nation's racial vanguard. And some of the things they put into place were things like the poll tax. You had to pay a tax in order to vote. Well, it disenfranchised poor whites as well, but not nearly as much, because many of the districts would put in an exemption to the poll tax. If you had previously voted, or your grandfather had previously voted, you remained eligible even if you couldn't afford the poll tax. That's where the term grandfathering comes from. So that's the privilege of voting. And then there are others, would be all kinds of civics tests. And it would be the registrar, almost always white, that was would go in and basically determine whether or not you had enough either literacy ability or civic ability in order to vote. And it basically, not only would it deter people because they had challenges to their eligibility, but it would just deter people from going to see if they were eligible. When you're getting the stink eye and you're getting repressed and you're not wanted in a civic life, and that's certainly what happened in the South. And here's what's interesting. Between 1895 and 1908, the rest of the states in the South approved new constitutions, including these disenfranchised tools like the Understanding Clause, which was about you had no basic civic knowledge, which is very demanding, and the other being a literacy test. And most whites didn't have to take that because they'd say, well, even though you may not be literate, you may not have civic understanding, but if your grandfather was eligible to vote, you were exempt from the rule. And obviously African Americans' grandfathers weren't eligible to vote because they were slaves. Very, very sad. And until the Supreme Court finally banned the principle of 1950 of grandfathering was no longer acceptable, but they obviously did something even more egregious than keeping people away from the polls, and that's segregation. The 14th Amendment was deemed applicable only to state action. So in private action, hotels, restaurants, any kind of private entity was free to discriminate. It didn't apply to the 14th Amendment didn't apply to private action until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And we also know that the 14th Amendment says equal protection of the laws and equal due process of law. And that was determined in a case in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. It was about rail cars, and they had African American, or back then I think they called them colored rail cars or black rail cars, and those for whites. And the court said the law must be equal. And as long as the rail car is adequately equipped in an equal fashion in terms of seating and windows and all that stuff, the law has been satisfied. The sad part about that is we know whenever you separate people, you separate them not only to make them one feel more superior and the other inferior, you do treat them inferiorly. There's just no way that would get away from that. We know that case, Plessy versus Ferguson, there was one judge. First, I want to mention this. In the civil rights cases, the 14th Amendment only prevented discrimination by the government. That was the first problem. Then 1896, basically 13 years later, Plessy versus Ferguson comes down and says, if it is even state action, the states can segregate as long as they're treated equally. Separate schools, separate trains, separate water fountains in the park, separate parks, as long as they're equal. But we know they aren't going to be inherently equal. It's just a really terrible. Justice Harlan was the only dissenter. And William Hurt, the actor, in case you're curious about some really obscure information, is the grandson of Justice Harlan. And he said, I'm going to find it here. Maybe it's not even in his book. I've read the case so many times. Justice Harlan went on to basically, he was the lone dissenter, and it becomes the majority decision, and he's dead by then, but his thoughts, his rationale, his beliefs in political philosophy of equality, his dissent basically becomes the theme of the majority decision, Brown versus Board of Education, that segregation is inherently unfair, unequal, and unconstitutional. But I'm trying to, Justice Harlan, the lone dissenter, countered, our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. Harlan went on to warn the court's decision would permit the seeds of race hatred to be planted under the sanction of law. And we know he's right. And it took until 1954 to correct that decision of Plessy versus Ferguson. It's big to be stuff on the test, midterm, certainly about Plessy versus Ferguson. And we know there were different African Americans that were working for change. One right here from Great Barrington, Massachusetts, W.E.B. Du Bois. E.B. Du Bois, there's actually, I believe, some kind of, I don't know what you would call it, a department or a research institute right at UMass, a couple W.E.B. Du Bois, I don't know what it's called, the endowed chair or something like that. And they have scholarships that go out to different colleges for people to do research on not only him and his history, but on civil rights related to African Americans in our country. We know he advocated significantly for equality, like real equality, like, in terms of the way we get treated in every aspect of life, whether you're African American or white. He was in direct, he comes a little later, their times overlap, but Booker T. Washington was very popular with many whites and blacks. And the reason why he was popular with many whites was he was a believer in, how do I say it without, although many African Americans today believe Booker T. Washington was a bit of a sellout. He thought African Americans should kowtow to a certain degree to whites, work really hard, show that you're worthy, advance your life, and eventually equality will come about through example and through perseverance. But always defer to whites who look down on you, for lack of a better way of saying it. W.E.B. Du Bois wouldn't buy that. He said, no, you don't accept the seat in the back of the bus. You fight for equality day in and day out. These guys were in his time. We know Booker T. Washington certainly fought for the advancement of African Americans, but he also felt that they should have a certain deference to the white dominant society at the time. He founded or started the Tuskegee University, and he got a lot of funding from philanthropists that were once the industrialist robber barons like Carnegie. Um, but he made a famous speech called the Atlantic Compromise. This is Booker T. Washington. Basically encouraged black Africans to cash your bucket down, to improve your lot under segregation, work really hard, but kind of accept where you're at. And W.E.B. Du Bois did not go along with it. These guys were very much at odds, and they had a very, very different vision of it. And I think in hindsight, most people think that W.E.B. Du Bois's vision was more appropriate. But some other people might argue, well, Booker T. Washington was using what he could and what tools he could have and still recognize that that's how you do it to survive. So it's hard to judge people out of context of their time and their situations. But I find that very interesting. Du Bois, a confrontational voice, boldly targeted white supremacy, where Booker T. Washington wouldn't have a confrontational voice at all. He said, we've just got to survive on our own. But the interesting thing about the progressive era that bothers me, and maybe hopefully bothers you, was it sounds so solitary. I mean, it's such a bunch of beautiful people trying to uplift, society, especially the wretched of society, the poor, the impoverished, the ignorant, the unwanted. But at the same time, it was, well, the unwanted as they saw fit, which would often be not the more recent immigrants from Southern Europe and Eastern and Southern Europe, and also African Americans. It was a very odd dichotomy, and these groups didn't always work together hand in hand. Sometimes they were in contravention of one another, but they actually came through with a lot of success. A lot of the progressive agenda still remains to this day, and some people come out and very proudly say, I'm a progressive. And what it means is you're trying to bring change where change is needed with the assistance of the government to improve the lives of Americans that are often left behind. And I have to admit that argument sounds very salient, but there's many other people that say, wait a minute, that's not what government's role at all. And when you're talking about government, you're talking about tax dollars. Some people say tax dollars of the America shouldn't be given to those people who can't make it on their own, and it's not up to government to create everyone to have sort of an equal outcome, because that's not what government's for. I tend to agree with the progressive concept of not necessarily equality of outcome, but equality of opportunity. And there has to be a baseline of a basic sort of civic humanity, and I think that's what makes the progressives very powerful. People shouldn't live in wretched slums and inner cities and not have basic decent pay and not have access to sanitary conditions and safe working conditions and reasonable work hours and the like. And I think most people agree on that baseline. It's how far we go on it that determines whether or not you get kind of radicalized in terms of going so far left, if you will. But what's amazing is now most people are progressive on broad different issues. But in that era, the progressive movement had like many different sort of similar, philosophical goals, but targeted at certain projects. They weren't always in a cohesive, monolithic group trying to fight for a better America on all levels. Many people had a very specific goal, whether it was working conditions for, child labor, or others when it comes to suffragette movement for women, the right to vote, often were mutually exclusive and they wouldn't necessarily overlap in their efforts. All right. I went on and on and on. I apologize.